Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Corporate Gossip Podcast. I'm your host, CPA Scorned. Not here with the data analytics playboy today. We just have producer Mike. And we have a very special guest for you today, the author of the book that we have just talked about in our last episode, Ringmaster. So Abraham Josephine Riesman is a journalist and the New York Times bestselling author of Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America. She has written for the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and New York Magazine, among many other outlets. And she goes by Josie. Josie, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's so nice to be here. And thank you for being patient. For the listeners, I canceled or rescheduled the previous date when we were going to record this because I got walloped with a cold. So thank you for not losing the faith in me.
Never. And I was so excited because I think we connected on Instagram.
Is that how it happened? I can't remember. I knew it was social media, but I guess it would have to be. I've been banned for a year. So anyway, go on.
Wow.
We
yeah, that's we met on Instagram, and I was just telling you how, Mike and I listened to the book on a 13-hour, ended up being like 20-hour drive to Atlanta and back. And then I read it, and then my whole family read it. And so, we know your book pretty well.
That's really lovely. That really warms my heart. Thank you. It's a grim set of topics, but as an author, you always like it when people actually want to read what you write. So thank you.
Of course. Yes. And we, and also to our listeners, it is on our bookshop.org storefront. Although I think we have the hardcover version, and the paperback version just came out.
Paperback just came out and has a bunch of deluxe extra features. We have 3 appendix sections and an afterword. The afterword, of course, is inevitably going to be out of date because books take time to publish. And I got it as up to date as I could as of when it finished, but there's still, it's such a moving story, not as in like moving train story, this Vince McMahon story, that my afterword is a little out of date. But other than that, it's all great. It's all great new stuff. You've got all kinds of new content. So I would recommend the paperback. Also, more importantly, the paperback is the first time my trans name has actually been on the cover of one of my books. Because my transition happened like right after we closed the cover for the hardcover. So bad luck on that one.
Congrats on both accounts. Yeah, let's get into it. So I have some questions here, some that we created, some that we got from our listeners as well.
Oh boy, from the listeners. I love that.
The first one here is, I know you were a wrestling addict during your teen years, and then you kind of stopped watching. And by the way, I think you and producer Mike, if I did the math right, are the same age. So I'm curious.
I was born in 1985, in late 1985. I don't know.
He's 1984.
So there you go. Roughly the same. Yeah. So
I'm curious if your guys' answers would be the same. But when you look back, how do you think professional wrestling has shaped your worldview?
It's funny. I was just thinking about that the other day in relation to, of all things, George Orwell, because I was remembering that by sheer coincidence, I happened to be very into wrestling when I first read Orwell's 1984. And I'd only been watching wrestling for about a year, maybe at that point. So it was still very fresh for me and thrilling. And I was very positive about wrestling. I was like a big proponent of the art form. And I also got very into it. So when I read Orwell's 1984, I got to the section where he's talking about how, at once we're at war with East Asia, then we're at war with Eurasia, and each time we pretend like that's how it's always been. The moral valences keep swapping and swapping. And I was like, that sounds like wrestling. Because the thing is, in wrestling, very regularly, especially in modern wrestling, you have characters abruptly switching from hero to villain or villain to hero, and the audience is supposed to shift their sympathies, or at least now a lot of people see through it, so it's not so much your sympathies as what sounds you make, whether it's a boo or a cheer. But those back when I was reading 1984, I couldn't help but notice that this political situation that Orwell was trying to describe, the ways in which propaganda can obscure the truth, it felt a lot like pro wrestling. And I remember just kind of feeling miffed. I was like, wait, Orwell's describing this phenomenon as a bad thing, and yet it's what happens in my favorite art form. And then I sort of discarded that thought for about 20 years, but I guess I came back to it in the book in some ways.
That's so interesting. So, I also think, I know you talked about wrestling being soap operas, but it's also, in my opinion, like a lot like reality television. And
Yes.
I've noticed
Yes.
recently that people are really struggling with the idea that you can, in one year, view somebody very positively, and the next year view them
Mm-hmm.
negatively, and the next year view
Mm-hmm.
them positively again. It's almost like once I make a decision about you as a character, I have to be committed to that.
Interesting.
Have you noticed that it's more difficult for people?
Well, in wrestling, you have to, not you have to. There's some people who really refuse to switch moral valences very often. People who just, and sometimes there are people who just don't really work as good guys or bad
Mm,
guys, respectively. And that's always kind of a je ne sais quoi. It's a hard thing to quantify whether somebody works in one way or another. But the best wrestlers, for the most part, are ones that have been able to successfully play both good guys and bad guys, and baby faces and heels in the parlance of wrestling. And you don't, these days you don't have a whole lot of long uninterrupted runs of only being one
mm,
moral way. So the audience is pretty used to changing their, at least their chance, if not their actual emotions about these characters. So I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, I don't know if what you were describing was the way it is on reality TV. I
mhm.
will confess that I don't watch a whole lot of reality TV, although I've watched enough to know that wrestling and reality TV overlap a lot. But in wrestling, it's not a big deal when people change from good to evil, which is kind of a dangerous thing. It allows you as the audience to just get caught up in the thrill of
Mm.
change and shift, as opposed to actually caring about what any of these people stand for. Not, I mean, I'm taking wrestling a little too seriously with that, but you can get quite cynical if you start looking at it purely as, nothing matters except the thrill of finding out that
Right.
somebody has changed from one side to another.
Well, so that's actually, it's interesting because I think a lot about, Vince McMahon as a heel, or I guess some, depending who you
I don't
are, of
know who's
course.
calling him a babyface
I
now.
don't know.
I'm
Maybe
not sure
maybe
there's
in
a
the
whole
younger
lot.
years.
Maybe himself,
Yeah.
there was this report recently that he went on a trip and brought back a bunch of puppies and kittens to give away. I don't know if you saw this, but yeah, I mean, it was, who knows? It was kind of a blind item. I'm not taking it too seriously, but the report is that since he dropped out of the public eye after the Janelle Grant allegations, which maybe we'll get to, apparently he's doing this campaign to try and be nice to everybody around him and started giving away puppies and kittens that he got on a trip.
I feel like that's how a villain would be nice. They'd be like, "Wait, what does everybody like? Puppies."
You said it, not me, but it is a very interesting choice. I think we can all agree on that.
Or at least I've really struggled with the humanization of Vince McMahon. Like on this
Mm-hmm.
podcast, we have a lot of like evil people, but we humanize them because it's interesting, and that's
It's hard to do
Uh,
with Vince after you know what you know from these allegations. Yeah.
so that was going to be my question: is like, on the one hand, he leaves this trail of trauma wherever he goes. He's a real piece of shit. I think that's not really a hot take, but on the other hand, he's has this tremendously horrific childhood, and I feel like
Yeah.
sympathy for him in many ways too.
You
Like,
have to. If you don't, then you've lost all of your capacities as a human. I mean, he had a terrible childhood by all accounts. And that was a huge influence on the way he turned out, as it is for anybody, their
Mhm.
childhood is. And, according to Vince, he was physically abused by his stepfather. And he heavily implied that he was sexually abused by his mother, although it was clear he kind of regretted saying that and walked it back a little. But what is incontrovertible is that he was abandoned by his biological father shortly after or shortly before his birth. It's a little unclear. My guess is it was slightly after his
Mhm.
birth, because Vince was baptized Catholic, which was not the religion of his mother, but was of his father. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. His father was gone. And for the first 12 years of his life, Vince the younger knew nothing about Vince Sr., the biological father, who was up in the Northeast. He was in DC and New York working at his father's wrestling empire and then taking it over when the father, Vince Sr.'s father, just died. And Vince Jr. didn't know any of this. He's just growing up dirt poor in North Carolina, in semi-rural North Carolina, moving from town to town with his stepdad and his mom, and allegedly having a terrible time with both of them. And only at 12 does Vince Sr.'s second wife bully him into going down to well, he doesn't even go down to North Carolina, I should say. That was the initial story that Vince suggested. But what it became clear from my research was Vince told a different story that makes a little more sense, which was the stepmom said, you've got to meet your biological kids, because Vince had an older brother, Rod, who was also Vince Sr.'s child. And Juanita, the second wife, went down sort of as reconnaissance to go meet Vince. Vince Sr. didn't even deign to do that. So you end up with Vince Jr., Vinny, who was only known as Vinny Lupton, not Vince McMahon. He was Vinny Lupton because his stepdad was a Lupton. And he meets Vince Sr. And according to Vince Jr., it was, and these are his words, love at first sight. There was an instant attraction. These are words he uses. It was a very powerful emotional connection with this older man, but the feeling was not really reciprocated by all evidence. It appears that Vince Sr. was a pretty cold man to his son, his biological son, Vinny, but was at the same time very loving towards a family that he had adopted, that he wasn't blood related to, relatives of Juanita's, whose patriarch had walked out on them. He took them in and was a father to that family. And according to the cousin I found, who was raised by Vince Sr., this cousin, not even through marriage exactly, but this cousin was about Vince's age and would talk about how Vince Sr. would just walk around telling everyone that he loved them and being very warm. All of Vince's stories about his father are, my father never said, I love you. My father was very cold. My father was one of those old Irish guys. You know how it is. They're very emotionally unavailable. It's a complicated and heartbreaking story because Vince, the younger, just spends the rest of his life from 12 onward trying to impress his father. Vince, as a child, did not have any interest in wrestling until he met Vince Sr. Even though he was in North Carolina, which is wrestling country, there's no evidence he watched it. He has never talked about watching it. He's always said, I discovered it when my father and I were reunited. And I could keep going, but that push-pull from his father is kind of the essence of how everything in his life played out, whether it's individual relationships with wrestlers and others where he played father figure to great consequence and sometimes great pain, or whether it's in the storylines that he directed, produced, booked, whatever word you want to use, the storylines that he was responsible for. Especially at the turn of the millennium, they were just this psychodrama about himself. He always said Stone Cold Steve Austin was him, even though he was in this rivalry with Stone Cold Steve Austin where he was playing Mr. McMahon, a character named Vince McMahon. He always said, well, that wasn't based on me. Vince McMahon was based on all the rich people I knew when I was a kid who I really resented. Well, guess what? Vince didn't know many rich people when he was a kid. I've been to these towns. The richest person he knew was his father. And his father didn't like him very much. So the only way you can end up deducing this psychodrama is if he thought he was Steve Austin and Vince McMahon, Mr. McMahon, I should say, was the representation of all the rich pricks he knew when he was a kid. It's him versus his father. That's why the book ends there. Also because I ran out of room on my word count, but it ends on him really becoming that character and becoming the worst parts of his father.
So we actually had a different theory that Mr. McMahon, a lot of kids who grow up with complex PTSD can sometimes create almost an alter ego for themselves.
Now that's interesting. I haven't heard that one.
So it was almost like a psychological coping mechanism to say, I'm Vince McMahon, and then Mr. McMahon is somebody different. That I like that. Done. Yeah.
I mean, I feel bad playing armchair psychologist, but Vince leaves it all on the table. I mean, usually you can't play armchair psychologist with someone, both because you're not qualified and also because you don't have enough evidence. Here, I'm not trained as a psychologist, but I know people pretty well. And more importantly, there's so much evidence out there if you're willing to look. A lot of it was on television. And then the rest of it I had to go digging for in North Carolina and various archives. But when you put those things together, I think you're probably not wrong. I think that both of those things can be true. And I would not be surprised if to some degree, the voice that is Mr. McMahon was something that kind of predates.
Right. It's
all of
almost
that,
like, or it could have been the person that he had wanted all along to be protective of little Vinnie Lupton in a sense.
I know. It could be. It's a really compelling and messed up story because the consequences of that abandonment and also of his father being a very harsh businessman were, that all resulted in Vince going, well, the one place where I can impress my father is in work.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to be even more of a son of a bitch than he was.
Josie, it's so crazy how we always joke that this podcast should just be called Daddy Issues, because so many of the CEOs that we study, who's he's so similar to, and we brought this up throughout the podcast, is Ted Turner. They had a very
Tell
similar
me more, because
upbringing.
I haven't done enough research into Ted himself, despite him being Vince's rival. That rivalry was less interesting to me, but I want to hear more.
So he had a very similar childhood growing up. His dad was not abusive, but just had a lot of, his dad ended up dying by suicide because of a business deal gone wrong. And he had a lot of kind of, I'm going to make it up to you, or I'm going to be the man you couldn't be, or whatever. His dad was kind of always disappointed in Ted because Ted wanted to be he wanted to major in classics. His dad penned this whole letter saying, you're going to be a total loser if you just study books all day.
Yeah.
So come back and work for my company. And he did. And in many ways, I mean, it's the story with him. It's the story with Jack Welch. I mean, we've seen it. I could list like 5 more of these.
No, you're completely right.
Yeah.
It was the story with Stan Lee too. The subject of my first book. Stan Lee I wrote this first book called True Believer, which was an investigative biography of the Marvel Comics editor. And what I found was really the driving thing in his life. And he said this, he just didn't analyze it as deeply as I think I did, maybe, but he wasn't doing a whole lot of self-introspection like that. But he always said that his desire to be more successful than his father was his driving motivator from when he was a young child, and then on top of that, Stan Lee, I mean, this is a whole separate thing, but on Stan Lee, you then have this denouement that's kind of inevitable with guys like that, which is huge problems with their children.
Oh my God. And
there's no way of escaping that. If you have that, if you've let those daddy issues power you to that level of untouchability, your kids are going to have a hell of a time. And like Stephanie McMahon and Shane McMahon as well could tell stories if they weren't under sort of familial NDA,
It's just a real quick anecdote on Jack Welch that kind of ties it all together. So he had said, ultimately, I wish that my kids, I wish I never gave them $50 million each. This is what he ended up giving them, because they kind of failed. They were flop kids. And I'm like, don't you think it could have had anything to do with the fact that, I don't know, you were a bad dad?
I know.
They make the connection. And I always think I think I said this line in the Vince McMahon, I go, God, imagine if McMahon just stuck a pinky toe into a therapist's office, how much things could change.
Well, the thing is, I've heard from women who are accusers of his, and without getting into too much detail, one of them who wouldn't go on the record, and I won't give any details about, talked about how he would just talk to her all the time. When they would be together before the assault, he would just talk all the time. And that was consistent with other accusations. That's not the only story like that. The accusation is often that it started with him really opening up. Janelle Grant said the same thing. It starts with long conversations with him. It's a common thing that happens with people in power, is if they aren't seeing a therapist, they'll often turn somebody else into a therapist. And then you hear horror stories about what happens when they feel betrayed or feel like that person hasn't been true to them, or if they just see that person's vulnerable.
So okay, I want to kind of move a little bit into that vulnerability thing, because One of the things, a couple of organizations that we've covered in this season, I think are very similar to, of the season of Corporate Gossip is similar to WWE, namely American Apparel and the Houston Astros.
Oh God, I was just talking about American Apparel. I was a teen anti-sweatshop activist, and American Apparel.
Wow, you must have loved Dove Charney.
No. That was the worst disappointment I've ever experienced. Was we were like, wow, American Apparel, finally a non-sweatshop company, and then Dove Charney just turns out to be this total schmuck. No pun intended.
Yes. So we're doing a whole episode. There's a wonderful documentary. I don't know if you've seen it. It's on YouTube. It's called Big Rad Wolf. And it's all about, I think they filmed it in 2020, 2021. It's so good.
Wow.
And the Houston Astros is another similar
that
company.
I know nothing about, but yes.
Yeah. So the idea is that the owners or the founders, the CEOs of these organizations kind of thrive in this environment where their employees accept being exploited because they're working at their dream job and there's no other show in town similar to where they're working. Yeah. And I'm curious, like now that the veil has been lifted somewhat on the WWE, Vince just, I think 2 days ago, sold his remaining shares. Do you think that there's a future for these wrestlers where they have greater protection, be it physical, financial, or legal?
Wouldn't that be nice? I don't think so. I wish, but the trouble is wrestling set the precedent in many ways of the gig economy, or at least it was doing the gig economy before that was cool. And I don't see that business model changing because it's not changing anywhere. Everything's moving towards the gig economy. I'm a journalist, and everybody's getting laid off and then told, well, why don't you freelance with us? It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's not exactly this. Wrestling's worse because you're held to a non-compete contract where you're not allowed to go wrestle even though you're an independent contractor, you can't wrestle for anybody else. So it's especially a farce. But I mean, a lot of us are in situations similar to that. So I don't see it getting a whole lot better unless there's massive governmental intervention, which I don't know who would do that. The closest thing we've ever gotten to that was Andrew Yang in whatever it was, early stages of the 2020 election, talking about how he was going to take on Vince McMahon. It's like, if the best they're sending is Andrew Yang to try and regulate Vince McMahon, this is not yet a top issue for anybody.
Well, it's funny because towards the end of the episode that we did, we thought, okay, maybe, if I were a government regulator, maybe the WWE should be broken up, almost like it's a big tech company. And then you could return to smaller promotions. You could get more diversity.
Sure, wouldn't that be nice? That'd be interesting.
Yeah. So do you think that WWE is too big to fail at this point?
I don't know who's taking it on. I mean, it's very lucrative for a lot of people, and we live in a country that has lost the regulatory state. We don't, not to get too heady, but we just don't regulate things in this country at the rate we used to. And very rarely do we add new industries into the regulatory sector and go, hey, we've never regulated this before, but let's try regulating it now. It just doesn't happen these days. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see a wave of that coming. And for the time being, WWE signed a $5 billion deal with Netflix to run Raw live on Netflix's platform. And it's you can't argue with success, I guess. The question will be, the government is allegedly bringing the hammer down on Vince himself, at least with this federal probe they're doing into misconduct. But, that has a bunch of question marks. He's beaten the federal government before on a steroids charge. Now, they did a lot of incompetence in that, the prosecutors, but could happen again. But also there's the whole factor of if Trump wins. If Trump wins, I can't see the DOJ pursuing that to its end. The two of them are very good friends to this day. And I don't know. I just don't. Maybe if the federal probe is really horrifying and shocking, there might be a law or something. I don't know. But the probe isn't even about wrestlers' safety. It's about misconduct. It's about Vince allegedly running a sex trafficking ring and abusing women at a serial rate, or just constant alleged abuse there. So that's not abuse of wrestlers in the common everyday way that wrestlers are abused. That's not the issue. That's, as far as I know. at the center of this probe, which is sadly par for the course.
I know at one point there was some class action, or maybe went to the Supreme Court, some wrestlers getting together. And
wrestlers have tried. It's just it never goes anywhere. And, you know, you have a predatory lawyer who's maybe conning these people, or they're just the fact that they're wrestlers. If you're old and injured, and that was the class of wrestler that was involved in this, in the lawsuit you're thinking of and the other legal attempts, you know, you don't have anything. You're nobody in society. Maybe you have some residual fame among wrestling heads, or maybe even among mainstream, but you don't have any money. There's no retirement plan in wrestling. There's no pension plan, you know, unless you were a huge megastar. And even if you were, everyone had a drug habit back then. Everyone's had to do alimony. You know, I mean, it's been a long road for these people. So you don't really have this rich, powerful constituency of injured ex-wrestlers. And you need to have a rich, powerful constituency to get something going.
Well, and then, of course, the first thing that people will say to you is, oh, you knew what you were getting yourself into.
Well, yes. And it's a self-selecting group, unfortunately, because wrestling is very obviously painful and difficult. Like early on, you find that out. But the people who manage to make it are the people who are so addicted to it. And I'm not the only person who's used that word. Wrestlers will tell you the first time you do a match, referees will tell you this. The first time you do a match, you're addicted. You just can't, there's no thrill and rush that compares to doing a wrestling match. Even for a small crowd, people will always tell you this. And so you end up with this population of people who are successful in wrestling largely because they love it more than their own self-preservation, let alone self-interest, you know? And that leads to a situation where you don't get a whole lot of people who even want to unionize because they love this so much, and they've already pushed past so many barriers that somebody who required or really believed in worker protections would have given up at. You know, they're still there. They've lasted this long. They're made people. Like in mob parlance.
Yeah.
Once you get past a certain point, you're kind of a made guy, and there's serious consequences if you speak out against the family, which is wrestling.
So that was one of the questions that I wanted to talk, or the topics I wanted to talk about, is like, you know, all these wrestlers now are finally coming out. I used to quote, now I don't remember who it was by, but they're finally kind of coming out against Vince and saying, like, look, none of
Bret Hart. I talked to Bret Hart.
Was it Bret Hart? Yeah.
Yeah, I was the one who did that interview.
Okay,
Slate.
yeah.
Bret was the first. He was the first wrestler to speak in unequivocal terms about denouncing Vince and saying he's done. And you know, Bret really set a path there. And now even WWE is kind of following that path.
Do you think that there's any regret of like, we should have, you know, spoken out at the time, or it's just one of those things?
It's just one of those things. I think for them. I think Bret definitely has regrets about that. He especially regrets discrediting the story of Rita Chatterton, who was the first female referee in the WWE and who claims that Vince raped her in 1986. According to Bret, he ran into Rita after he'd heard sort of advanced rumors of what was about to come out. He ran into Rita at a convention not so long ago and said, "I'm sorry, I got it wrong, and I'm really sorry that I spoke out to say that I didn't think you were telling the truth." So that's kind of rare. You don't get a whole lot of regret in wrestling. It's much more like what we were talking about at the beginning with this 1984 thing, where you just go, well, now Vince is the bad guy, and let's not talk about the fact that we supported him for so long.
Just a couple days ago, Vince just sold his last shares of WWE stock. You know, I'm not going to try to guess why he did that, but what do you think it's like in the WWE right now, like not having this family involved? I know through Stephanie and Triple H.
Yeah, well, Triple H is still, Triple H, the current chief creative officer, and on-screen representative of the company. You know, he's married to Stephanie McMahon, Vince's daughter. But the extent to which Triple H, as this guy is known, also known as Paul Levesque, his birth name, the extent to which Paul Levesque and Stephanie McMahon are still even in touch with Vince is very unclear. And my guess would be they're limiting their contact with Vince because Vince is the subject of a federal probe, and both of them were employees in the C-suite under him. So there's a lot of, I would imagine there's a lot of anxiety in the C-suite, at least, about what's going to happen when this probe drops. Probably a lot of hoping that Trump will win, which is common among wrestling executives and wrestlers as well. There's a lot of just Republicans in that field. But I think even more than that, there's a sense of this could go away if Trump wins. But more importantly, I think, they're trying, at least publicly, maybe not more importantly, but more publicly, they're just doing this Orwellian turning of the page, where it's exactly what I described at the beginning. You have, at WrestleMania weekend, which is now this whole extravaganza of televised and non-televised events, you had people constantly saying, this is a new era. This is the Paul Levesque era. The past is gone. We're driving out of chaos. And they kept using nomenclature, words that Vince McMahon didn't allow them to use on the air. They kept saying, this is the WWE and we love pro wrestling, because Vince only allowed them to say sports entertainment. Or like, I'm a pro wrestler, because you had to be called a WWE superstar or just a superstar. And, the audience you can refer to as fans now. Before, Vince said you had to call them the WWE universe. All of that stuff was on parade, all of the old standard nomenclature. And I'm sorry I'm fiddling with my hair. I just want to tell the watchers of this, I'm watching on a mirrored screen, which is totally fine, but I keep reaching for the wrong side of my head. So if you're wondering why that's happening with my hair. Anyway, I just felt I had to give some explanation for that. But where was I? I'm sorry, I got distracted.
Oh, just all this different language that
yes, they're using all this different language. And the point was to say, we are at war with Vince, and we have always been at war with Vince. It was to say, the new era has begun. Forget that we were ever on his side in the past, much less that his side was us. It's not just we had some sympathies for Vince. It's we all carried water for Vince. We all validated and made Vince possible. And now they're just acting like, well, that was a bad time. Let's move on.
And ironically, that's exactly what Vince did. He loves rewriting history. He loves making.
That's what I'm saying. It's all part of the wrestling ecosystem.
Yeah. Let me ask you one more question, and then I'll see if Mike wants to come back on screen. But I am dying to know what you thought of Vince's mustache, which I think debuted the same time as your book.
Around
we were shocked by it.
It was something. I don't really know. We were playing Armchair Psychologist, and I can't play Armchair Psychologist for that one. I have no idea why he chose to grow the mustache. He was allegedly out on the town a lot with younger women, so maybe he thought it made him look younger. I have no clue.
It's actually very Ted Turner-like, which
it is. That's actually a good comparison. I'm eventually writing a sequel to this book to get us up to date. And I'm definitely going to investigate more of the Ted Turner parallels. I feel like a moron for not having seen that exact connection. But that's what, this is the world we live in, is rich individuals, usually white men, forcing us to live inside their own daddy issues all the time. Like, we're just trapped in this world where a very small number of men, Trump, Elon Musk, the Ted Turner and his ilk, and Vince, of course, you end up just having to live in a media ecosystem and a politics ecosystem and even an economy that's just dominated by, I have to prove something to my dad, and I have so much money that you have to deal with the consequences of that.
Yep. You just described the Koch family.
Exactly. It's all, it's just like, I have problems with my family, and you are going to suffer for that because I have so much money that my opinion matters way more than it should.
We always say one way to fix the economy is mandatory therapy for anybody who has over $100 million. Court mandated.
There's other policies we could institute, but that one would certainly lead to some interesting revelations and paper trails, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. Let me have Mike come back on.
I got back into wrestling a little bit, and then that led her to this, which is now why we're here and why the episode.
Well, thank you.
No, it's great. And the book's fantastic.
Appreciate that.
I guess based on kind of what you guys were talking about, is there a world where WWE could exist without. Let me even look at AEW, right? That just comes from daddy's money. Like, it all seems to stem from somebody having a ton of money or a ton of influence going, hey, I can do this better than somebody else is doing it. Do you think that wrestling goes from regional, territorial to where it was before it got sold to TKO at that scale without the daddy issues, right? Like, do you
I
think
don't know. I mean, maybe it has motivated a lot of people to do what they did. Would the world be better without that? I hope. I mean, daddy issues and being abused by your father or neglected by your father should not have positive consequences in the world. Like I would prefer to think that a world where people were not mean to their kids would ultimately be a happier, more sustainable world, but it's not the one we live in. That's not you're just describing the general state of things. It's not just that wrestling, you can't get something started without daddy's money. You can't get anything started without daddy's money. I've already come out as a trust fund kid in other sections of the media. So I mean, the only reason I can be a journalist right now is because my grandfather got rich selling Christmas tree lights to Gentiles. We were a Jewish family and we made all our money selling Christmas tree lights and did very well for ourselves. And there's a nut of money that I've just been able to sit on. And the reason that I mention that is because I want people to know that that's unfortunately a key element of becoming successful as a journalist now. Like, there just aren't any working class jobs in there. I try to do as much responsible journalism I can with that funding that I have from my long dead grandfather. But ultimately, wrestling, journalism, movies, music, all the things that are fun and creative are incredibly hard to get going or to participate in unless you have that buy-in of generational wealth.
And now that we have TKO and then with UFC, it's basically turning into a giant combat sports, publicly held company
entity. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So do we see a future where there is more now collective bargaining? Is there more? Do the athletes hold less or more power to create more of a pension situation, a health?
I think they hold a lot less power because, like I said, the momentum in the economy in general is against.
They're more disposable.
I mean, I love the unionization efforts that have been happening in other industries, but a lot of other industries you have other places have unionized. There's no unionized wrestling ever. There's no model for how you unionize a wrestling company. There are models for unionizing a lot of workplaces, but wrestling has very firmly resisted unionization for its entire existence. So I think they will get caught. They are not going to be able to easily catch the headwind of unionization that, say, is happening in maybe barista in the cafes and in newspapers and online media. You have some unionization drives there. I don't see that happening in wrestling, but I could be wrong. I'd love to be wrong.
What's your take on after now having the post first Vince McMahon WrestleMania as the future of the sport itself? Do you think that we're heading in a good direction?
The future of the sport, of the art form, really, of the medium of wrestling is very bright. I am not worried about wrestling as an art form. I am worried about wrestling as an industry. The art form is actually doing quite well. You have more wrestling fans these days than you did even a year ago, or much less 10 years ago. You've got a really wild upsurge of coolness associated with wrestling, which hasn't happened in a good long while. And more importantly, I think the real revolution in wrestling is not happening on television. It's with all the independent queer wrestling. There's a lot of queer and trans wrestling leagues and, promotions around this great country. You go anywhere, you can find local wrestling, and a lot of it is becoming queerer and queerer. And that's where I see real beauty and innovation happening with wrestling. The stuff that you see on television is great, and there's a lot of really good wrestlers out there, but I see the real innovation coming with the boundary pushing matches that a lot of LGBTQ wrestlers are doing out there. So also, I happen to believe that society as we know it is not going to exist in the way that we know it in 10, 15 years. Things are changing very rapidly. And even if the electrical grid goes down, wrestling will survive. That's not an issue. Wrestling doesn't require electricity or computers. You can just set up a ring or set up some mattresses in the post-apocalyptic wasteland and have a wrestling match. It's a natural.
It's almost like the gold dusts of the world are now becoming more of the forefront rather than
gold dust.
What's going on over here?
The gold dust idea was very interesting. It was just being played for at least a healthy amount of spite from dum-dums.
Right.
So that said, queer people loved gold dust because gold dust has played by Dusty Rhodes' son of all people. You have this really weird boundary pushing and kind of uncomfortable sexuality on screen and gender on screen.
And it was almost
I want to see that happen all the time.
Before it was even ever like in the common, universe of existence. Inside of wrestling, you could have someone like that be incredibly successful.
Yes.
It's almost like an incubator for what society is going to be eventually.
But
you allow these certain things to happen that
but
society is not prepared for. And now we're seeing it become more of like a forefront, both genres, both areas, both arenas. Yeah,
absolutely. Although I think gold dust only deserves a certain degree of credit for that. A lot of it just comes out of queer people loving the same wrestlers that everybody loved, but seeing beneath the veneer to kind of the inherent queerness that lurks under the surface of wrestling. I wrote a whole essay called Wrestling Turned Me Cis, Then It Turned Me Trans, about how when I was a teenager, wrestling was really an instrumental thing in me closeting myself. But then when I came out, it was after 2 years of doing research into wrestling, and those things were not unconnected. I had seen machismo on parade in Vince's life and really thought I'd rather be away from that. But more importantly, I saw in wrestling all of these big, strong, male-bodied people not only wearing bright colors and touching each other, which of course everyone will say, isn't that a little gay, whatever. More importantly, they show vulnerability and pain because every wrestling match rests entirely on at least one member. Well, really, it has to be both people's ability to telegraph a pantomime of I'm in such agony that I am paralyzed, that I'm going to scream at the top of my lungs, that all of these things that you're not supposed to be as a man, you have to do in wrestling. You have to show, I'm in so much pain right now. Unless you're the Ultimate Warrior, who was a terrible wrestler and an even worse person, you don't ever have wrestlers who don't show pain in their faces. And that is something really powerful, showing off that secret face and being vulnerable like that. And that all added up to a lot of revelations for me. But that's true for a lot of queer people and a lot of trans people, is that they watched wrestling when they were young and something about it really struck them. But as they got older, they realized that there's this weirdness and vulnerability beneath, and that's what we get really attracted to.
Okay, I have one final question for you before we wrap, which is,
fire away.
You're on a desert island. Which wrestler, dead or alive, are you bringing with you?
Sammy Stein, the Hebrew champion, who was very popular during the Great Depression. He was in a film with the Three Stooges. We have MJF over at AEW, who identifies as Jewish on screen and is Jewish, obviously. But Sammy Stein, it meant something different to be a scrappy Jew back in the 1930s, and I really give it up for Sammy. He would also wear sandals outdoors, and there's in his like muscle man sandals, and I just love that he showed off his sexy little feet. I think
little grippers.
Yeah, little grippers. Yeah.
I love that. Awesome. Josie, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. This was so much fun. And
I had a great time.
Like I said, everybody, make sure you go to the bookshop.org storefront where you can buy the new paperback extended version. And Josie, where can people find you? Definitely follow you on Instagram because she's a great follow. Where can they find you?
Thank you. On Instagram, I never promote my Instagram. I probably should when I do these podcast appearances. I am unfortunately stuck with my old name on Instagram because Facebook makes it near impossible for you to change anything if you're verified. But I'm Abraham Joseph there. However, if you want to find more about me, the hub is my website, which is josie.zone. That's like JOSIE.ZONE, like the Twilight Zone. And that URL will take you to my site. And if you're on Blue Sky for some reason, I'm josie.zone there. I spend way too much time on Blue Sky, but nobody else does. And ringmasterthebook.com. Sorry, that's the book website. I should tell people to buy the book. That's an important thing.
Ringmasterthebook.com.
Ringmasterthebook.com. That is correct.